Again, to summarize, I proposed a fourfold approach to Jesus, to Christology. The Jesus, the risen Jesus of the church, the Jesus that we experience in discipleship or together in worship, the textual Jesus, which we looked at last month. How do the gospel writers present Jesus? There's the question of the Jesus of the tradition, which we'll be looking at in November and December. How does the church historically understand Jesus? And then for this next 4 weeks, the month of October, we're going to be looking at the question of the historical Jesus. Again, my argument is that all four are necessary to understand him. But there's an emphasis in the model I'm using. It has its roots, as you'll see tonight, in the work of Martin Kaler, but it also has roots in Lutheran pietism, and going back before that it has roots in the Devotio Moderna, the modern devotion of the late Middle Ages, the group that produced the Imitation of Christ, the very famous work. And it has, roots throughout the history of the church. The argument is pretty simple. In the words of the Anabaptist thinker Denk, to know Christ is to follow. Only those who know Christ follow him, and only those who follow Christ know him. In other words, there is no knowledge of Jesus apart from discipleship. Okay? And so this leads us into the title of tonight's talk, which is the burden and the promise of the historical Jesus. First, I want to talk about the historical Jesus as promise, because that's the way the historical Jesus research really saw itself in the 19th century. Up until this point, up until the late 18th century, the early 19th century, Jesus was framed and his story understood strictly within the categories of Nicaea and Chalcedon, the two big councils from 325 and 451. He was human and divine. And then how that gets all played out for that 200-year period. How much human is he? How divine is he? How does the human nature relate to the divine nature? Does he have one will or two wills, one mind or two minds? Is his mind divine or human? All of this stuff, how it plays out, that is the way the church tended to think about Jesus. And so the stories of Jesus' narrative, the stories of his life, what he did, were normally throughout the history of Christendom, especially from the Middle Ages forward, enshrined in the stained glass windows of the cathedrals and the city churches. That's where you saw the story of Jesus, was in the windows, or occasionally when the lectionary would have the story of Jesus told. But it's not until the 19th century, that the question begins to arise as to whether this is an adequate portrait of Jesus. And as science is a discipline, is emerging really from the late 1600s. I mean, you could go back into the 1600s, the 1500s, 16th century with Galileo and Copernicus. You can go back that far. But really, the science of history, or historical science, does not really begin until the late 1700s, early 1800s. That's when the science of history begins. Archaeology, as a discipline, will take off later that century. And that's when all the pillaging occurs, particularly by the British. They'll just go everywhere, and they'll dig and dig and dig without any thought as to what they're destroying while they're trying to find something they think they're finding. And fortunately, archaeology has changed as a discipline since. And so now when they do a site, they do all those radio photography things to see what's there. And they start digging with toothbrushes and teaspoons, rather than bulldozers. And And so they're able to uncover a lot more. But the 19th century was an era of discovery, enormous intellectual discovery. You think about it this way. The 19th century starts off with the philosophy of Immanuel Kant and the theology of Schleiermacher, and it ends with Nietzsche and Adolf von Harnack as the leading lights. And there's big difference. That's a huge amount of growth. It's 100 years worth of change. So think back, for example, 100 years ago, Karl Barth had just published his Epistle to the Romans in 1918, so a little over 100 years ago. And there's a lot of water under the bridge in that 100-year period. So we're looking at 200 years worth of intense research that we must also take into account that the discipline, the methodologies of the discipline, the way that history is conceived and understood, it has changed dramatically. And so it's important, if you're going to ever get into this business of the historical Jesus, and you start picking up the classic works, you know when they were published, because there's only a certain amount of knowledge that's gained up to that point. And when a writer writes a book like Schweitzer writes his The Quest of the Historical Jesus at the turn of the 20th century, there's only so much knowledge that he has that we have different now. But his book is a landmark book, for example, because it examines the entire last century. And so we're going to take a little dive into Schweitzer's Quest tonight. There was another book that was written at the end of the 19th century that did not, during its lifetime, receive the kind of attention that it has received really in the 20th century. And that's Martin Kaler's little book, The So-Called Historical Jesus and the Historic Biblical Christ. That book would have an enormous impact on the so-called neo-Orthodox movement. Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Rudolf Bultmann, and such. And then the reactions to all of this, and then the reactions to all of that, and then the reactions to all of that, and then we have where we're at today. So for example, if you go to the bookstore and you're looking at books on Jesus, chances are you're going to run into books that are written by scholars in the last 20, 30 years that are part of what's known as the third quest for the historical Jesus. Now, the third quest, in my personal opinion, has ended. And there is no real new quest for the historical Jesus. I'm tending to think at this point that the quest for the historical Jesus is just as much at a dead end now in 2021 as Kaler said it was at the end of the 19th century. But does that mean that nothing can be learned about the historical Jesus or from research on the historical Jesus? And this is the question that we're going to delve into in 2 weeks. If you want me to open the present and tell you the surprise secret, it's this. The historical Jesus doesn't exist. It's a phantom of scholarly imagination. But research into the historical Jesus and into Jesus' background, Jewish culture, Jewish thought patterns, literature, faith traditions, all of that, that is still hugely important for understanding Jesus. So let me begin by acknowledging that the historical Jesus in the 19th century was a promise, because the Christ of the church had become little more than a barnacle-encrusted ship, and people were being asked to believe all manner of doctrines and dogmas that they could not even begin to fathom or understand. How could Jesus be both divine and human? How, again, as I pointed out earlier, was his will human? Was it divine? This kind of thing. How about his mind? And you know that these kinds of decisions get played out in the Christian tradition, and they have implications for discipleship and church. So, for example, if I assert that Jesus was simply a human being, a prophet, perhaps like the Buddha or Muhammad, a great man, no doubt, but just a man, there is no need for me at all to take seriously the confession of faith that's found in the New Testament that Jesus is more than a man. In other words, while Mary Magdalene in Jesus Christ Superstar might say, he's just a man, the fact is the New Testament writer said, no, there's something else going on here that's well beyond human, that can only be categorized as divine. There's something happening here. On the other hand, if I was to take an ancient heresy, that of Apollinarius, because it's so prevalent in Protestant Christendom, and I was to say, Jesus was just like you and me in every way, except his mind was divine. He thought the thoughts of God. And so he could do God things because he thought the thoughts of God. Well, at that point, Jesus is no longer like you. He's just not. And sorry, when I let people in, I lose my train of thought and I have to mute them all at the same time. So I apologize. That's why I like to start on time and then carry on. If this was a real classroom, I'd lock the door and you wouldn't be getting in after I started lecturing. There are actually professors that do that. If they go, they lock the door, and if you didn't get in, you're out. So anyway, but we don't work that way here. We'll show mercy. So there are ways of framing Jesus that are actually quite deleterious for understanding Jesus and for understanding the Christian faith. But one of the promises of the historical Jesus, as these early researchers began to look at his life and just simply say, okay, forget about all this Christian confessional stuff, forget about that. We're scientists. We know that the earth revolves around the sun. We know, for example, that there are no more miracles. There's just no more miracles. They don't happen. We don't see them, therefore they don't happen. We're going to examine the life of Jesus purely from at this point in the early 19th century, from a rational perspective. Okay, we're going to ask, who is this human Jesus? And the beauty of that is that the historical Jesus quests, the three that we've been through in the last 200 years, have indeed provided us with a human figure, as it were, a sage, a prophet, a rabbi, a teacher, a miracle worker, a shaman, an exorcist, a preacher. There's all these kinds of things Jesus engages in that others in his culture engaged in. We've begun to put some like flesh and muscle on this little skeleton that we have. The problem is, and this is where Schweitzer's book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, was so important. When Schweitzer went back and examined the life of Jesus movement, that's what the first quest of the historical Jesus is German, and it's known as the Life of Jesus movement. And everybody and their brother was going to the Gospels and trying to get into the mind of Jesus, the human mind of Jesus, to show his development and how he thought and what his psychology was and this and that and the other. And they tried to write a life of Jesus. And this was done on the level of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books. I mean, maybe thousands, okay, over the course of the century. It's said that when Schweitzer was writing his book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, you could barely walk into his office because there were just simply piles and piles of books with little pathways through them to get to his desk. And you can see what an immense amount of research Schweitzer did to write this book. But this whole 19th century Life of Jesus movement Schweitzer ends up condemning as nothing more than everybody and their brother, because there weren't women writing about Jesus at this time, it was men, everybody and their brother projecting themselves onto Jesus and then writing his story. So that they were really just writing their own story, but they were calling it Jesus. Now, we know that is a phenomenon. That happens still today. Okay? That's a fact. And it's something that every interpreter of Jesus has to deal with. Okay? This is one of the burdens, is the problem of projection. So, for example, if you've read my book, The Jesus-Driven Life, how do I portray Jesus? Well, I portray him as an outcast, intellectual, someone who's studied, but not necessarily studied formally, but somebody who's more self-taught, an autodidact, who's a very charismatic figure and a miracle worker. And however I portray him there in the Gospels, what are you really getting in those first 3 chapters of the Jesus-Driven Life? You're getting a Jesus that looks like me. I'm an outcast. I'm a self-taught intellectual. I've got some shamanic background to do the healing stuff, So the first 3 chapters of the Jesus-Driven Life, where I even ask the question, will the real Jesus please stand up? I am doing my best to give you a well-rounded portrait of Jesus, but it's still very influenced by who I am. Okay? Now, the one thing I can say about the Jesus of the Jesus-Driven Life is that, number one, my tendency is not to forgive. My tendency is to take vengeance. And yet I am willing to let Jesus talk about forgiveness and eschew vengeance. So in that piece, he's not like me at all. I'm recognizing that there's something strange about him that doesn't fit me. Okay. And again, I want to point out to you that we've talked about this ethical pattern, this didache, the great command to love Lord your God, your neighbor, your enemy. Okay. And to treat those like you want to be treated, to live nonviolently in forgiveness, all of this. We've talked about all of that. It's that ethical pattern that is the strange part of the Jesus story. And it's the part that is almost always in Jesus research passed over. And I think especially because most Jesus scholars still operate within a law gospel covenant contract kind of logic. Okay, they're still stuck in religion. And so it's hard for them to see Jesus coming in and breaking apart something. That is, they inhabit a worldview just like fish inhabit water. Fish don't question the existence of water. They live in it. It's like you don't question the existence of air. You breathe it. It's there. You only question its existence when it's taken away from you. Correct? Okay. So the historical Jesus is a burden and a stumbling block as well. And Jesus becomes a stumbling block in historical Jesus research, I think far more frequently than he deserves, when Jesus is portrayed as a zealot. Now, this phenomenon will first occur with Reimarus, the first so-called thinker on the historical Jesus back in the 18th century. Jesus is portrayed as a zealot who wanted to bring in the kingdom and failed. And then the early church needed a way to vindicate him. So they said, oh, let's just talk about God raised him from the dead and made him Lord and all that kind of stuff. And now we've still got our Jesus. And that's how the church, the Christological dogma, was related to the historical Jesus. The historical Jesus was the true Jesus, and all the stuff the church said about his divinity and all of that, that was just all bullshit. And that's the first stage in historical Jesus research. So when Schweitzer writes his book, And this is just for convenience sake, by the way. The dates aren't quite exact. But basically, you can go from 1800 to 1830, 1830 to 1860, and 1860 to 1890. And again, they're not quite exact. It goes into the early 20th century. But in these 30, 35-year periods, there are going to be very distinct moves made in this life of Jesus research. The first one occurs under the influence of a fellow named David Frederick Strauss. And I've mentioned his book before in a previous lecture, The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. It's a massive tome. I mean, it must be 600-700 pages in translation. And David Frederick Strauss is a church person. That is, Strauss is not an agnostic or an atheist today writing about Jesus like we have so many people today that are trying to do that. Strauss is within the church, but he's recognizing that essentially the Jesus that's created by the church, and that includes the New Testament gospel tradition, the New Testament, was that this Jesus that's portrayed as mythological. And so we need to get back to a historical Jesus rather than this mythologized Jesus of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so the period from about 1800 to 1830 or so in New Testament studies, and this is also the time frame that the Tübingen thesis about Paul and Jewish Christianity is being developed by F.C. Bauer. And David Frederick Strauss will be influenced by F.C. Bauer, although he's working in Jesus, and the Bauer thesis that we're using on Paul is a separate set of questions. During this period of time is the first inklings we're going to get that there's a real problem with the Gospels. That is, they don't tell us the truth. They're not factual. They contradict each other. You have the temple, cleansing of the temple narrative in Matthew, Mark, and Luke occurring on Monday of Holy Week. And yet in the Gospel of John, it occurs at the very start of his ministry. So the large question looms. Historically speaking, when did the cleansing of the temple occur? Did it occur at the end? And thus, was it one of the causes for the Sanhedrin to crucify him? Or did it occur at the beginning of the ministry as Jesus' grand introductory statement, this is who I am, this is what I'm all about, and then we read everything in light of that? Or we could do what D.A. Carson and a lot of evangelicals and others, that follow the Reformed tradition want to do. We can say, oh, he did it twice. He did it at the beginning and he did it at the end, because once wasn't enough. And for some reason, he does the same exact thing both times, but it's obviously the case that he does it twice, because they can't seem to conceive that either the Synoptic tradition or the Johannine tradition has fudged with history. So in the second period of the life of Jesus research that Schweitzer examines from 1830 to 60, 65, right in there, is when the turn to the sources. We're going to go, oh, if Strauss says that the portrait of Jesus in the Gospels is mythological, can we, in fact, go back and figure out the development of this tradition? So what's the first gospel written? Up until this time, the Catholic Church's position, followed by the Protestants, was that Matthew was the first gospel written. Luke second. Mark comes along and does a little Reader's Digest condensed version, and then the Gospel of John. And that was the standard order that it was thought the Gospels were written in, until H.J. Holtzman came out with his study on Markan priority in this period of time, the 1830s to 1860s. It's also at this time that Holtzman identifies a, quote, common tradition to Matthew and Luke that he calls lambda, or L, that will later be changed in research to the Q document, so-called Q document. And if you're at all familiar with my work, you know I don't buy the Q document as a document or a hypothesis. I don't think it existed. But nevertheless, during this period of time, Holtzman says, let's go back to the earliest sources. Okay, so we can skip, the later sources, Matthew, Luke, and John. And what we're going to do is we're going to go back to these two early sources, Mark and Q, and we're going to try and figure out who this historical Jesus is from these early sources. And so if during the first period, the 1800 to 1830 period, the question was historical Jesus or supernatural Christ, during the second phase, it was, are the synoptics or is the Johannine gospel correct? Which one contains history? And so we get back to the sources. And then in the period from 1860 up until Schweitzer's writing his Quest of the Historical Jesus in the first decade of the 20th century, eschatology gets rediscovered. And eschatology is this understanding of Jesus as a preacher of this reign of God thing, this kingdom of God. And so Jesus comes preaching this kingdom, and then all of a sudden you have the Johannine gospel where you don't have any of that kingdom language. You have Paul with his divine exalted Christ. There's no preaching of the kingdom of God. And so now you have, the question is, was Jesus eschatologically oriented? Did he see himself as the one that was bringing in the future? Well, Schweitzer will end up at the end of this offering his own discussion of Jesus, and he concludes that Jesus was a thoroughgoing apocalyptic thinker, so thoroughgoing that he actually believed he could change history, and in trying to change it, he grabbed the wheel of history and tried to move it and ended up getting crushed by it. And now he hangs on it as it spins round and round. The wheel of history spins round and round with the dead Christ on it, forcing us to ask about his relationship to history. But we have to reckon that his message and everything else was an utter failure. His view of the coming kingdom of God, all of that was a failure. And that's how the first quest ends. Now, this emphasis on eschatology at the beginning of the 20th century, and not eschatology the way you know it, in terms of dispensationalism and the rapture and all that. We're talking about a focus on the end time in the message and teaching of Jesus. As this emerges at the beginning of the 20th century, it's going to powerfully influence a very young Karl Barth, who will say in his earliest epistle to the Romans, eschatology that is not Christology is no eschatology at all. And that will end up in the 1980s as a line of thinking, I think, that bore really excellent fruit in a book. Now I'm drawing a complete blank, and because I'm not at home, I don't have my The Place of Jesus Christ in Eschatology is the name of the book, and I'm forgetting the South African author's name. But Koenig, K-O-N-I-G, Koenig or Koenig. This emphasis on eschatology would shift everything in historical Jesus research. Well, in the 1920s, Bultmann will write a book on Jesus, having already said you can't do historical Jesus research because the Gospels don't give us any information about him at all. And at the end of his book on Jesus, he says, we got lucky. There might be 8 or 10 verses in the Gospels that are really historical Jesus verses, and we can just trace the shadow of his ways and this and that and the other. And that's very, very, very reminiscent of and it's still repeated by modern scholars. For example, Bob Funk of the Jesus Seminar, or Bart Ehrman. Some of you might know Bart Ehrman, okay? There's nothing new under the sun. It's old stuff that gets repeated and rehashed and frozen and then deep fried and then served again, in a different form for you. In 1953, one of Bultmann's students, Ernst Käsemann, decided it was time for a new quest and went back to an examination of the sources again, but this time began examining Jesus in the light of Judaism. This is some of the emerging post-World War II dialogue between Christianity and Judaism. Käsemann still will assert that apocalyptic is the mother of Christianity. Okay, in other words, there is no Christianity without this apocalyptic kind of thinking that the Lord is coming soon, the kingdom of God is coming to earth. But he says, in contrast to his teacher, Bultmann, that there are things that can be known. What significance they have is a different story, but there are things that can be known. And another of Bultmann's students will come along, Günter Bornkamm, and does excellent work here in his little book called Jesus of Nazareth. And in that book, he takes a similar tack and seeks to tease out more than just these 10 verses that Bultmann would allow as part of the historical Jesus process. And at that same time, there is a scholar in Germany, Joachim Jeremias, who's an Aramaic specialist. And Jeremias will look at the Gospels, and because he's familiar with Aramaic and how to translate Aramaic into Greek and Greek back into Aramaic, he will seek to show that, in fact, there's an awful lot of material in the Synoptic Gospels that can be turned back into Aramaic, and it makes total sense. But then the problem is, and this is where Jeremias was critiqued, how do we know that's not the early Jewish church creating all kinds of stuff about Jesus in Aramaic that later gets translated into Greek? So is it possible that Greek stuff in the New Testament can be retranslated into Aramaic? It doesn't belong to Jesus, it belongs to the early church. And so in the 20th century, the debate fundamentally revolves around this. Who is the creative genius? Was it Jesus, or was it the early church? And if that's the case, how is it that the Jesus who appears on the scene in Galilee proclaiming the imminent kingdom of God and this and that and the other, how does that figure relate to the one that's proclaimed rather as crucified and risen Lord? How do the two relate? Or in other words, how do the Gospels and Paul relate to one another? Do you see how we keep cycling around the same questions over and over again in the history of Christendom? Now, the third quest for the historical Jesus is the one you're probably most familiar with. You read Marcus Borg, you read John Dominic Crossan, you read Bruce Chilton, you read N.T. Wright. These are all folks that are part of this larger third quest. Now, the third quest for the historical Jesus really begins in the 1980s and 90s. It's since petered out, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But it begins with the application of other disciplines to the Gospels, to the narrative of Jesus, and to the study of history. Sociology is one, and literary criticism is another. Those are the two dominant disciplines that get brought to bear. And so there's this explosion of literature in the 80s and 90s, in particular in the 90s. A lot of the research is done in the 80s, and the papers are written in the journals and this, that, and the other. And then the books start coming out in the 90s. And then in the early 2000s, the scholars start going on tour and get famous, okay? So in this time frame, we're learning a lot about Jesus' culture, background, and environment. We're also opening up a whole bunch of literature that heretofore had been previously ignored by New Testament scholars, like the pseudepigrapha, the rabbinic literature, etc. The Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, continue to play their role in opening up all these questions. The Dead Sea Scrolls played a significant role in all of this. And we begin having Jewish scholars at this time writing studies on Jesus. Now, Some of the most interesting studies on Jesus are not written by the Christians. They're written by the Jews. Joseph Klausner, David Flusser, Giza Vermesh. For my money, Giza Vermesh, I have most of his books. He's the one that portrays Jesus as a chassid, a charismatic holy man, and does an awful lot of work with that particular stereotype. Not stereotype's the wrong word, type, just type. The holy man that can heal and cast out demons. And he shows these other figures in Judaism that are similar and places Jesus within that trajectory. David Flusser, the Jewish scholar, however, I think does much, much better work because he recognizes that at the heart of Jesus' message is this business of nonviolence. Now, you have to understand that for most Jewish scholars working on Jesus nonviolence is a problem because Judaism has just come out of its most violent episode, the Nazi Holocaust, the Shoah. And you don't talk about nonviolence to victims of violence. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't work. They can't process it. But Flusser, in his work on Jesus, in particular the Sage from Galilee, again, is able to see that, and whereas other Jewish scholars don't. But they do some of the best work because what they're trying to do is they're trying to go, look, you Christians have to understand Jesus was a Jew, not a Christian. And so look, you've got to look at Jesus through Jewish eyes. So I don't know how many books I have in my library that have titles like Jesus and Judaism, the Jewishness of Jesus, Jesus the Jew, the religion of Jesus the Jew, and on and on and on and on. That particular part of this third quest research has interested me the most. I'm much more interested in how Jesus is perceived from a Jewish perspective than from a Christian scholar's perspective, because Christian scholars are already bringing in an entire army of presuppositions with them when they come to deal with anything related to Jesus and Judaism, particularly a lot of supersessionism, which they try to avoid, but ultimately they can't. And so we move from Bultmann's shadow, we can barely know the outlines, in the 1920s, to Jesus Christ Superstar in the 1960s, who's a hipster that parties with his friends, and even Judas is a good guy. You know, what's the buzz? Tell me what's happening, you know, and Mary Magdalene can fall in love with him, and, you know, and all this kind of stuff that happens with Jesus. And then, of course, through all of this, there raises its head from time to time the specter of Jesus, the violent zealot. And so it occurs in the mid 20th century with S.G.F. Brandon's thesis, Jesus and the Zealots, which is completely rebutted by scholars like Martin Hengel and Oscar Kuhlmann. It raises its head again in the 90s and early 2000s with Eisler's view of Jesus as a zealot. And then a few years ago, you'll recall, there was a journalist, not a scholar, a journalist, decides to write a book on Jesus in light of Second Temple Jewish thinking, and he proclaims Jesus was a zealot. The title of Reza Aslan's book was simply Zealot. And that book had a profound impact from when it came out, when it was published 2014, 2015, on emergent progressive Christianity, which wants to see Jesus as the guy that gets in there in the temple and is beating people and whipping them and hurting them because they're being unjust. And so if you can use the temple narrative to justify violence, you can do just about anything and justify violence everywhere. And you can ignore, again, that strong ethical piece that runs from Jesus through the gospel tradition into the history of Christendom. And so for me, for my money, the problem with the study of the search for the historical Jesus, the Jesus who lived and walked and breathed and taught, is fraught with this very singular problem of projection. We all seek to make Jesus in our own image. Okay. Now, I have in my notes this question of what use is the historical Jesus? Of what use is the historical Jesus? If we cannot say with any degree of certainty about anything about the historical Jesus, what are we left with? I want to read to you something out of Kaler's book, the so-called historical Jesus, and then a follow-up comment on that from Karl Broughton, who did his PhD dissertation on this and translated this book into English for us. This is Kaler first. This is written back in 1896. We do not possess any sources for a life of Jesus, which a historian can accept as reliable and adequate. I repeat, we have no sources for a biography of Jesus of Nazareth which measure up to the standards of contemporary historical science. A trustworthy picture of the Savior for believers is a very different thing. And of this more will be said. Our sources, the Gospels, exist in such isolation that without them we would know nothing at all about Jesus, although the time and setting of his life are otherwise entirely clear to historians. He could be taken for a product of the church's fantasy around the year 100. Furthermore, these sources cannot be traced with certainty to eyewitnesses. In addition to this, they only tell us about the shortest and last period of his life. And finally, these sources appear in two basic forms, whose variations must, in view of the proximity of the alleged or probable time of origin of these forms, awaken serious doubts about the faithfulness of the recollections. Consequently, the unbiased, air quote, critic finds himself confronted by a vast field strewn with fragments of various traditions. Now, if that creeps you out a little bit, if that bothers you, it's because you're looking for certainty where it cannot be found. History is not a discipline of certainty. History is a discipline of interpretation. And in the 19th and through the early 20th century, it was assumed that history was the search for facts, for data, raw facts. And it's now recognized that even the search for so-called facts comes with biases that allow us to only see certain things as facts. In other words, postmodernism's roots go all the way back to the beginning of the Enlightenment. And we are experiencing today the full fruit of which many of these previous questers experienced either the bud or the flower. We now have the full fruit. This is now Karl Broughton commenting on Kaler. Historical science had posited the aim of representing Jesus' true historical reality as a self-enclosed complex of inner and outer facts as they existed in themselves. The historiographical ideal was to discover the empirical truth about the Jesus of history by means of presuppositionless criticism. And again, the historian saying, oh, I'm trained as a historian. I have no presuppositions. My presupposition that there's no such thing as miracles is not a presupposition, it's a fact. And that's what they did. They turned their presuppositions into data that they would then use to assimilate into talking about what the historical Jesus was. The historian, quote, back to the quote from Broughton, was first to establish the objective facts, and then somehow or another arrive at value judgments. It was thought that facts and their history of interpretation could be divorced. Now, that's an important sentence. It was thought that facts and their history of interpretation could be divorced. Why is that important? Because the Gospels themselves are written from within the church. That is, the Gospels tell us as much about the early church as they do, quote, the historical Jesus. They can do both, but they cannot be separated. And the mistake of the life of Jesus research of the 19th century and the mistake of the third questers, especially the third questers, the new quest for the historical Jesus that began in 53, that middle second quest didn't do this so much, but the third quest is basically said, we can figure out who Jesus is apart from Christianity, when in fact, just as you cannot separate the Son from the Father, you cannot separate the Son from the Spirit and the Spirit's localization in the body of those who follow Jesus. Jesus, by the Spirit, has chosen to have his story told in multiform fashion by those who followed him. And we know of four in particular: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then, through a sideways glance, Paul, who has things to say about the, quote, historical Jesus. And you'll recall that I find Saul Ackerman's work, Saint Saul, that's the title of the book, to be immensely helpful in demonstrating two things. One, there's actually a fair bit of historical information about Jesus in the letters of Paul, enough to say that Paul was familiar with the stories and traditions that circulated about Jesus, as well as some of the sayings of Jesus, or the so-called teaching of Jesus. And number two, the real benefit of that book is its critique of the Jesus Seminar. And so I want to conclude by talking about the problem of the Jesus Seminar and the American Jesus. Many of you are familiar with the Jesus Seminar and the writers that all participated in that from all different backgrounds and denominational affiliations and religious backgrounds, Jewish and Christian, atheist, Catholic, Protestant of all stripes, etc. Now, the Jesus Seminar was started by Bob Funk in the 1980s. Bob Funk was a brilliant Greek scholar. In fact, the best Greek grammar on the market is still Funk's Greek grammar. It's just still the best. It's excellent. Okay, but Funk grew up fundamentalist, and he hated fundamentalism. And as I understand it, as the story goes, he made it his life's work to destroy the Jesus that his family and everybody that he grew up believing in. It was his mission to destroy that Jesus. And so he starts the Jesus Seminar, and then they start doing, various stories and text year by year by year by year, analyzing them and doing research papers. And then at the end, they all vote. If I put a black ball in for that particular saying, it means I'm convinced it's not the historical Jesus. If I put a red ball in, it means probably not. If I put a pink ball in, it's like maybe. If I put a white ball in, I'm sure it belongs to Jesus. And you collect all the balls, all these colored balls, and then you amalgamize them or aggregate them. And then what are you left with? Bob Funk with his book, The Five Gospels, because he's got the Gospel of Thomas in there. And the fact is, there's, again, only about a dozen authentic sayings of Jesus in the Gospels. The rest is made up by the early church. We can't know Jesus. And that's where the Jesus Seminar ends up. And if Bob Funk was to go to that extreme, there's another scholar who doesn't quite go to that extreme, but is very close to that, that's very, very popular. And that's John Dominic Crossan. And some of you have read Crossan's work or his book, Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography, because it's Crossan who portrays Jesus as this Che Guevara figure that's all over progressive Christianity. You with me on this? Okay? In other words, the historical Jesus research isn't simply neutral. It has played a significant role in the way the churches have understood Jesus, or I would say rather, have misunderstood Jesus. And so we cannot, I'm not going to be the one that tells you, for example, that there's only 10 authentic sayings of Jesus in the Gospels, or there's 500. I know what I think, okay? I know what my position is on a lot of this. And you'll often hear me say, like, for example, when somebody brings up hell, and then they quote Matthew, I'll go, well, that's Matthew, that's not Jesus, right? Okay. Well, that could just be an easy way out. That's, I could say, well, anything I don't like isn't Jesus. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, right? Okay. But if I can demonstrate redactionally that an author has tendencies and certain words are part of that author's vocabulary, and therefore certain ways of thinking and speaking belong to the author and not to Jesus, well, okay. So I do that, okay? I think that a substantive amount of the material found in all four Gospels can be traced back to the historical Jesus, not his exact words, what are called his ipsissima verba, but to his voice, his ipsissima vox. We don't necessarily have the real words of Jesus, but we have his real voice. Okay? So, for example, some of you have read René Girard, okay? Or Walter Wink. Now, when you read the writings of Walter Wink or René Girard, you're going to be reading this literature through a lens. I knew Walter Wink and René Girard. I was their protege, both of them. Who do you think has the better understanding of what's being written by Walter Wink or René Girard? The eyewitness or somebody else? Yeah, the eyewitness does, right? The problem is, are any of the Gospels written by an eyewitness? Only one claims to be so, and that's the Gospel of John. And yet it's that gospel that actually has, quote unquote, very little ipsissima verba, the exact words of Jesus, and it has these rather long-winded discourses. And so scholars just want to throw out John, and I want to sit there and go, no, you don't understand. We may not be dealing here with a speech Jesus gave, but we are dealing with his voice, the way he was understood by someone who knew him intimately. And so, for example, there's I don't know, have any of you heard me talk about Mark and Mark in the crucifixion narrative where Jesus says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, and he's misunderstood by the crowds? Okay. Now, I don't know why. I have it in my head that I got that from a conversation with René Girard, that this is the first instance that demonstrates the atonement will be misunderstood. The text already tells you the atonement's going to be misunderstood. Now, that René doesn't write that anywhere. I think it's from a conversation I had with him, but it might have just been me. But I attribute it to René because in my mind, that's where I got it from. You with me? Or let me give you another example. How many of you own the book Reading the Bible with René Girard? Okay. Do you know that book that I edited? It's a transcript. It's a video transcript of 11 hours of interviews with Girard, but I edited that volume. And when I was doing it, René and Martha both said, Michael, can you make this René's voice? Change whatever you need, turn it into René's voice. So if you compare the manuscript that I published with the actual transcript, there's a lot of editing I did. In fact, I even put a sentence or two in there in Renee's mouth, okay, that he would approve, and Martha would approve, but I put words into Renee's mouth, because I know his living voice, okay? He never said it, folks, but I heard it, and so I added it because it belonged as something that Renee could say, or I could even say would say. You with me? Well, it's the same process with the gospel writers. And so, to conclude this first talk, the historical Jesus is at the same place today as it was in Martin Kaler's time. It's at a dead end. Does that mean we don't continue seeking the historical Jesus or doing the necessary work? No, it doesn't. But it certainly means that our methodologies have got to include a recognition of a fair amount of self-deception on our parts, and that we project ourselves. So if you read Bruce Chilton's lovely book, Rabbi Jesus, that presents Jesus as some Merkabot mystic. Well, if you know Bruce Chilton personally, Bruce is an Episcopal priest that has a lovely, deep, rich spirituality that's very mystical. Well, of course his Jesus is going to look mystical. Or William Herzog's book, Jesus the Prophet. Herzog taught at Andover Newton Baptist Seminary, American Baptist Seminary, and very social justice oriented. So of course his Jesus is going to look like a prophet. You with me on this? What I do with historical Jesus research is I keep everything held very lightly. Everything. There are a few pieces of historical Jesus research I've taken in as bedrock. One, for example, is Jesus' use of Abba as unique. That's unique to Jesus. That's central to his teaching. And Jeremias has demonstrated that. Another piece that I take as absolutely historical is his teaching on forgiveness, because as I noted already 11 years ago in the Jesus-driven life, forgiveness is a part of every type of genre in the oral tradition prior to the Gospels. You find it in parables, you find it in miracle stories, you find it in narrative, you find it in all kinds of different genres within the Gospel tradition. So there are certain things that I take as into me personally that belong to my portrait of the historical Jesus. Another, for example, would be the category of the reign of God, not the kingdom of God. And this is where I think historical Jesus research has really gummed it up for 200 years. They've wanted to say Jesus taught the kingdom. We go to Jewish literature. This is what they said about the kingdom. If Jesus taught that, he ends up a failure. And I want to say that's because Jesus wasn't teaching that. When Jesus talked about the reign, R-E-I-G-N, of his Father, he's thinking in completely different categories than this Davidic warrior Messiah. And again, these are things we're going to develop in these next few weeks. I simply wanted to open up this great big Pandora's box of historical Jesus research and say that at the beginning of the 21st century, I'm still a disciple of Martin Kaler, who wrote at the end of the 19th century. And for my money, this little book really lays an excellent case for being able to articulate that Jesus cannot be known apart from the life of the believers that follow him. And that's another reason why when people reject Jesus, it's because they reject Christians. They don't reject Jesus, they reject Christians and their Jesus and their view of Jesus. Does that make sense to you? All right.